Boy, do we have a fun episode planned for today. It is the midway point of the NBA draft. Now that it has been a 2-day event recently, it gives us a really good opportunity to sit back, take a breath, and digest what just happened. Instead of getting the whole draft at once, we get the first round. We get to sit back. We get to say, okay, this is how this player fits on this team, and this is probably what this team could look to address in the second round. Maybe we get some deals throughout the day. There's still a number of really exciting players still available, but really, this was a wild first round. I think outside of the first 4 picks, it was very difficult to predict the rest of this draft. Made it a ton of fun. We had some very surprising picks and then some kind of surprising picks, a few trades that happened, maybe not as many as we were expecting, but we did get a ton of trades before the draft, and I'm assuming we'll have a lot more this summer. So it should be just the beginning of a very, very fun offseason. But we're going to have, as we always do on Tuesdays, Matt Lawson in here. We're going to go through and try and fly through the first round, give analysis on every single player that was taken, maybe talk about some of the trades, maybe talk about a couple of players that are still available that we really like and that we're expecting to go pretty early in round 2. It should be a pretty loaded episode, but it should be a ton of fun. Before I bring Matt in, I just want to remind you guys that Bet Online continues to be your number one source for all your sports betting action. And with baseball season in full swing and football season around the corner, Bet Online has more ways to stay in on the action with the latest odds, news and scores, and even live in-game betting. From the MLB to UFC to tennis and NFL futures, BetOnline remains your choice, your top choice for sports wagering info. In between games, you can head over to the BetOnline casino with all the top Vegas-style games, including poker and a live casino. Head to the website today and take advantage of their industry-leading VIP program with level-up bonuses and weekly cash boosts. BetOnline, the game starts here. All righty, and we are ready to talk about the 2025 NBA draft, at least the first round of it. We have Matt Lawson back with us, and we're going to fly through the whole first round, so I'm not going to waste too much time introing it here. But, Matt, I do want to get your thoughts on just how you think the first round went overall.
It kind of felt like we were in for kind of a chalk first round when we got through the first 4 picks or so. And then things slowly started to unravel a little bit. It was Ace Bailey surprisingly going to Utah, Jaeger Demon jumping up in the top 8. And it felt like the draft was getting a little bit tipsy at that point. But as we'll get into, the draft got blackout drunk at a certain point as we got into the teens. Some decisions were made that people are going to regret this morning. I think that we're back to a level of front office and competence that I thought we had moved away from in the 2010s as we got into the 2020s. But we're back, and teams are making irrational choices that make no sense at all. I'm excited for it. It makes me even more excited about where we're going to be headed in free agency as we see the haves and have-nots of the NBA front offices combating against each other to be able to see who can take advantage of other teams first.
Yeah, I mean, professional sports aren't professional sports without at least a few boneheaded decisions, just making things a little bit more fun, a little bit more dramatic for all of us. Because when everyone makes the right choice, it gets a little boring. So I'm glad that there are at least some people that are bold enough to use Nico Harrison's word and his quote of fortune favors the bold. I guess if that's a good way to justify trading Luka Doncic, at least it makes it a little bit entertaining for us.
Yeah, this is going to be a situation where I think that we're going to have to parse between what made sense in real life and what's going to help us in fantasy. Because I think there's plenty of situations here where maybe these weren't the right selections. Maybe they were too risky. But there's opportunity in different places that's going to give us opportunity as fantasy managers to be able to take advantage of that. And we're going to have to separate out what our real life basketball brains are saying versus what we're going to see from fantasy production for some of these players.
Definitely. And in order for you guys as dynasty managers to avoid being the Portland Trailblazers of your draft, it's really important to listen to this episode as we fly through all of these picks. We're going to start with Cooper Flagg in Dallas, the expected number 1 overall pick. Obviously has been the number 1 guy for a while. We knew he was going to be in Dallas. We've been analyzing the fit for a while now. Any thoughts you want to add to how we should value Cooper Flagg short-term and long-term?
Well, I think the big thing is that there might be some perception for people who maybe didn't follow college basketball that closely that Cooper Flagg is kind of what people thought he was before coming into the season. Oh, he's the next version of Andre Kurlenko. That isn't what Cooper Flagg actually is. Cooper Flagg is the evolution of the on-ball power wing mold that we're seeing in the NBA, where guys are power forward size, but they're able to create on-ball, score from 3 levels. He is also going to be one of the better defensive rookies that you'll see come into the league because of his ability off ball and at least solid on ball ability. But the consistent effort, the ability to be disruptive, the ability to be able to read and react and process the game on the defensive side of the ball is there. He's going to be impactful in both fantasy and real life immediately. Someone who I cannot wait to be able to start running projections to be able to see where he's going to land in redraft leagues this year. But a no doubt number 1 overall pick in your dynasty drafts, regardless of format. You don't trade him. You don't get cute with it. This is a guy who I think is a top 5 dynasty asset in both categories and points league formats. He's the foundation of your team. If you're lucky enough to have gotten the number 1 pick, you retain it, you take Cooper Flagg, and you enjoy the long, illustrious career that is about to unfold.
100%. I was talking with Dan Titus from Yahoo just briefly yesterday about how we should value Cooper Flagg in redraft leagues. And I think there's an argument to take him in the second round, just off the sense that Kyrie Irving is going to be out for at least the first 3 to 4 months of the season. So there's going to be a lot of playmaking opportunities. He's a really efficient player, but obviously in dynasty, like top 5 asset. So we'll see where he ends up going in redraft leagues. I think I'd feel better about him being a 3rd round guy. But just to keep the pace, we'll move on to the San Antonio Spurs, who selected Dylan Harper with the number 2 overall pick, and then got Carter Bryant with the number 14 pick. I think it's a very solid haul for them. We knew Harper was going to be the guy, and there was talks that Bryant was going to go earlier, maybe like 9 or 10. So to see him slide to 14, a really strong wing defender for them to add. So what are your thoughts on their haul? And then we also did have a question from Twitter. If you're looking to trade a guy like Dylan Harper in Dynasty League, what type of value would you be expecting back? Is it like a top 40 value type player, higher or lower? What do you think?
Yeah. So number 1, your instinct should not be to trade Dylan Harper. And I think that this is where the impatience that kind of gets created by fantasy football can infiltrate fantasy basketball and dynasty fantasy basketball. There's an expectation that gets created by people who play fantasy football that rookies are going to immediately produce, some of them at the highest levels, whether it's quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers. We've been spoiled by that in the NFL because the careers are so short. In the NBA, these players, many of whom were drafted last night, are 18, 19, 20 years old, sometimes at the oldest for some of the lottery picks. Their primes, so the prime for an NBA basketball player doesn't start till 23, 24, 25 years old. So we're years down the road, second contract for some of these players. Dylan Harper is, I think, a top 35 dynasty asset. I think I have him number 31 right now in categories rankings, number 34 in points league rankings. You should not be looking to break him apart into multiple pieces. Now, if you're impatient, your timeline doesn't fit, waiting a couple years for Dylan Harper to really start producing at the level that we expect him to across his prime, then you could do a 1-for-1 deal in that range of getting a top 35 player. If someone else's timeline is the opposite of yours and they have a player who's right in their prime right now and you can get that immediate top 30 production, that's something you could consider. But what you should not be looking to do is break Dylan Harper into a bunch of smaller pieces in hopes that maybe you get an aggregate value that's equivalent to the value that you're trading away. That's not the way to be able to play Dynasty, especially the shallower your league format is. If you're talking about a 10 or 12 team league, absolutely not. Dylan Harper is going to be a fantasy star, and I think he should be treated as such immediately. If you have the number 2 pick, I'm taking Dylan Harper regardless of format, and I'm holding him. Now, when it comes to Carter Bryant, I think that this is a great pick by the San Antonio Spurs. I think what they've done here is added a 3-and-D wing who can guard 3s and 4s in the long term and be switchable for them going forward as well defensively. And it's not going to be a high usage player. They're going to need players like this to be able to fit around Victor, Dylan Harper, De'Aaron Fox, whoever the next iteration of the Spurs core is going to be in future years. They're going to need these kinds of role players who are going to be able to fit around that. A good comparison is what Aaron Gordon became, is what we're hoping Carter Bryant can be. And without the years of trying to be an on-ball creator that don't work out like it did in Orlando for Aaron Gordon, he's going to go straight into being the kind of player that is going to fit into a winning formula in San Antonio. I think the long-term vision is for him to start at the 3 or the 4 next to Victor. And that's the kind of guy that you're going to get in his prime. Now, immediately, it's going to be rotation. He's going to be behind potentially a Harrison Barnes. He's going to be behind a Jeremy Sohan. But I think eventually he can emerge into a starter. So he's someone that I'd be looking to be able to take somewhere around his draft slot in rookie drafts, understanding that it's going to take a little bit of time for that production to be able to pop off, and not thinking that I'm going to be getting that immediate kind of top 125, top 100 production. That's not going to come because the minutes aren't going to be there. But eventually he does have the fantasy stats set to be a guy who could have top 100 seasons because he produces defensive stats, solid rebounder, and he's going to be able to hit some threes as well.
Yeah, I really like just both additions for San Antonio, but I do think as far as fantasy basketball, they're both guys that we're probably gonna have to wait at least a couple of years before they're producing high level value. Dylan Harper, I mean, you mentioned for Carter Bryant with Harrison Barnes and Jeremy Sohan there, and then with Dylan Harper, obviously De'Aaron Fox and Stephon Castler there. Devin Vassell's still in the mix somewhere. Even Keldon Johnson, to an extent, is in the mix somewhere right now. So it's a bit of a logjam that won't allow both of them to play a significant role early on, especially with San Antonio probably looking more towards making the playoffs next year, assuming everyone is able to be healthier than they were this year. But long term, really excited about what they were able to bring in with this draft. Next pick was number 3 to Philadelphia. They brought in VJ Edgecombe, which I think is pretty much what we were expecting. Like you said, it didn't get kind of crazy until a couple picks after this. What are your thoughts on his fit overall? We did have a couple questions about kind of what his floor or ceiling would look like. And then also, is he the guy that you would take third in a rookie points league draft, or is maybe somebody else that we'll talk about next, somebody to be more intrigued by?
Yeah, so with VJ Edgecombe, I think that the kind of realistic high-end outcomes look similar in fantasy to a Dyson Daniels, who has turned himself into an elite steals producer and is kind of solid across other categories. And I think that's, if you're looking for a realistic outcome for Edgecombe of what it could look like, it would be he's a big minute starter who's super impactful in the steals category, doesn't really hurt you anywhere else. That's what you should expect. So if you saw what Daniels did last season, it's hard for anyone to get those levels of steals production, and I'm not necessarily expecting that. But we need to remember this is a Nick Nurse system for as long as Nick Nurse is there, who takes players like a Gary Trent, a Tyrese Maxey, and suddenly they're putting up league-leading steals because the defensive scheme is allowing certain players, and VJ Edgecombe is a perfect fit for this, to be able to hunt steals, jump passing lanes, and be disruptive. I think that's exactly what he's going to be allowed to do. I will caution, again, he's probably not walking into 30 plus minutes a night as a starter straight out of the gate. We're going to see in the coming, 2 weeks whether Quentin Grimes is back on this team. I think he likely will be because that's how restricted free agency works in the NBA. It's difficult for players to go anywhere else, but we'll see. But you're going to have a pretty crowded situation between Maxey, Grimes, Jared McCain, and VJ Edgecombe. There's only going to be so many minutes when we know Tyrese Maxey is going to be playing huge minutes for Nick Nurse. So I would caution that the production will be a little bit muted because the minutes are going to be a little bit muted, at least as a rookie. He's going to supplement that with, I think, big per minute steals production, which is going to help you in categories leagues, but it could be a little bit more muted in points formats. Right now, I would not take Edgecombe at number 3 in a points rookie draft or a categories rookie draft. I think it's the same tier. I'm leaning against it right now because I think the short-term production isn't going to be as strong. And I don't think of this as being the next Victor Oladipo outbreak. I don't think you should be drafting someone to see an outlier level of breakout like that. Oladipo became a completely different player. That's not what you should be expecting when you draft VJ Edgecombe. You should be looking for more realistic outcomes, something like what we see from Dyson Daniels with a little bit of less steal production, but still near the top of the league.
And yeah, when we get to that player that you think should be going number 3, definitely let me know. But as far as VJ Edgecombe, yes, the steals are going to be really good. I am not super optimistic about him playing a lot, like you said, with Jared McCain in there as well, Maxey, Quentin Grimes. But maybe it's a pretty decent rookie year. And then within like 2 or 3 seasons, he's up to that level of minutes where we do see that Dyson Daniels type breakout, maybe potentially a little bit more offensive juice, but we'll see exactly how he develops. The next pick was number 4 to Charlotte, and they were able to add Conk Nipple with that pick. And then they also traded Mark Williams for pick 29, a future first. I think there were some other seconds in there as well, and got Liam McNeely with the number 29 pick in this draft. So we'll talk about Mark Williams a little bit later on when we talk about Phoenix. But what are your thoughts on what Charlotte's haul was? And then I know they also have picks 33 and 34. So I'm really expecting them to take a center with one of those picks because I don't think they want to enter the season with their center rotation as Yusuf Nurkic and Musa Diabate.
So in the brief portion of the season that we saw with kind of the full roster of the Charlotte Hornets, we saw a ridiculous amount of three-pointers being put up by Charles Lee's team. And the goal seemed to be carrying over from what Joe Mazzulla does in Boston. Charles Lee, coming over from that Boston coaching staff, seemed to be saying, we are going to be near the top of the league in three-pointers. That continued with these two selections, that the attempt to bring in Concanipple and Liam McNeely, who project to be two of the better shooters in this entire draft class. They're going to put up a lot of threes in Charlotte. And I think Knipple brings a stability to his game where he's both a really solid all-around offensive player. That high three-point shooting volume is going to be brought to the table immediately. And I think his size and strength are going to allow him to at least be a neutral defender in the NBA. I think he could start day one. We've already seen that Josh Green just underwent surgery. I don't know if he's going to be ready for the season. I don't think he necessarily warrants penciling in as a starter. So you really have a hole there with LaMelo Ball, Brandon Miller, Miles Bridges, and if they're starting Yusuf Nurkic, Musa Diabate at center, or if they bring in somebody during once free agency opens and we see further trades, that's possible. But it really does feel like Concanipple may be a day one starter for this team, which is going to bring fantasy production in itself. Now, it's a little bit more muted from both the categories and points perspective than you would like. I think he's going to be able to be productive, scoring points, not killing you in field goal percentage because he's pretty good from inside of the arc in being efficient there, even though he's shooting a high volume of threes. The three-pointers will be there. I think he can be a better rebounder than he showed at Duke. He was playing around Kamen Malawach, Cooper Flagg, Sion James. There were a lot of plus rebounders around him, and he was that player coming up at amateur levels before his season at Duke as a stronger rebounder. So I could see him improving in that area to at least be neutral and not hurting you, but he's not really going to get steals or blocks. So the production's really going to be coming from threes and free throw percentage, points, depending on the amount of shots that he's able to get up. That's really where you're going to be able to get it. So I'm taking maybe him a little bit below draft slot, especially in points leagues, but still within this tier between 3 and probably around 8 or so, where I value the players pretty similarly. Concanipple's a good choice in there. It's not going to blow your socks off. I don't think he's going to be a fantasy superstar, but the high-end outcomes could look something like a Desmond Bane, who's consistently putting up right around top 40, top 50 seasons, pretty solid across the board. I think that's the kind of player that Concanipple can be, and it's never going to be top 25 production. It's not going to be superstar fantasy production, but Concanipple is going to be able to fit in immediately as a big-minute player for the Charlotte Hornets.
Yeah, I really like the Knipple pick, and I have been saying for a little while now that I think that if Charlotte takes him at 4, that yes, he would slot in as that starting shooting guard next to LaMelo, Brandon Miller, Miles Bridges, and at the time, Mark Williams. Now I think there's a little bit more of a question mark as to who is the starting center and what that looks like. And I really like that fit. I think there's going to be a ton of threes and an opportunity for him to show that he is more than a shooter. I think I struggle a little bit more with the Liam McNeely pick in the sense that I feel like they just added 2 shooters. And I think McNeely would be, I think he's better than what he showed at UConn, but almost like a watered down version of Concanipple in the sense that he is a shooter that can maybe do some other things. Neither are great defenders, and LaMelo Ball is also a questionable defender. So I don't love Charlotte's usage of their pick, and to trade Mark Williams just to get Liam McNeely, I think was, just an interesting pick for me. But we'll see. Maybe Liam McNeely ends up being significantly better than he was in college and more like the player that we thought he was when he was a 5-star coming out of high school. And then it could be a really nice value pick for Charlotte. Moving on to Utah at number 5, they did not care that Ace Bailey didn't want to be there, and they selected Ace Bailey with the number 5 pick. And then they traded up from 21 to 18 to take Walter Clayton Jr. And I think the theory was that they leaped Miami because it seemed like Walter Clayton Jr. had a promise from them. I mean, I think that's the only reason you would say that if you could have dinner with 3 people dead or alive, you'd say Eric Spoelstra, Rick Ross, and Kobe. That has to be the reason. So they're able to add Walter Clayton. I think that Utah really needs to find a solution at point guard, and Walter Clayton could be that. So I don't hate the selections, but I think it's just interesting that Ace Bailey made it clear he didn't want to be there, and then Walter Clayton probably thought he was going to be going from University of Florida to Miami, and now he's going to Utah. How happy is he going to be about that? What are your thoughts on Utah's draft haul?
In the history of the Utah Jazz, we've never really seen NBA players say, well, that's the destination that I want to go to. They understand their place in the NBA infrastructure. They're not going to be that team. And they can't pretend that they're going to be at some point. They're not going to be a free agent destination. But what they can be is a place of ample opportunity. And that's exactly what Ace Bailey and Walter Clayton Jr. are both going to get going forward. Now, not only is there opportunity on this year's Utah Jazz team, because honestly, there just aren't that many good players on this roster. There aren't that many players that I think are going to be part of the next playoff Utah Jazz team on this team currently. And there aren't that many players who can create their own shot and do it efficiently. I think Ace Bailey is coming into a situation kind of like Con Knipple, where there's an opportunity for him to start immediately on this team. He can be protected by having Lauri Markkanen and Walker Kessler being kind of the bigger bodies in the front court for him, allow him to be able to create offense. And Will Hardy's offensive scheme is going to create a lot of good looks for Ace Bailey. It's a very creative offensive mind and really great at being able to, as we saw in a couple seasons prior, create a lot of great shots for Lauri Markkanen. And I think Ace Bailey is going to benefit from that. I think they're going to attempt to try to roll out the red carpet for him to be able to feel like a star player immediately on this team. And I think there's going to be incredible opportunity in fantasy here, because what's kind of hidden under all of the drama around Ace Bailey is that he's a plus rebounder. He's a plus shot blocker. You're going to get points and threes from him. So we're already talking about 4 categories where he can be a plus. The field goal percentage was not actually that bad considering the number of contested shots at Rutgers. And I think that can improve with time as he improves his strength. The steal rate doesn't hurt you. The assists were not there. They probably won't be. And he's probably not going to be a great free throw shooter, although we saw that kind of wax and wane throughout his season at Rutgers last year. But this is a plus positive 4 category player in categories leagues and an overall strong fantasy stat set for points leagues. I think there's a pretty strong argument to take Ace Bailey at number 3 in rookie drafts in that tier of 3 through 8 that I was talking about a little bit earlier, because of the immediate opportunity, the long-term opportunity, and the overall strong fantasy stat set. There are risks. There are red flags here. Very few players taken this high have an assist to turnover ratio this poor. Obviously, all the drama around where he was going to go creates some concern. But I think he's going to get the star landing spot and the star opportunity that it sounded like he wanted to. It's just coming in the mountains of Utah rather than on the East Coast. And he'll have to deal with that, but I think he's going to adapt to it quickly, especially because I think the Jazz are going to make him feel like a star immediately and give him that star opportunity immediately. When it comes to Walter Clayton Jr., there is nothing here in this guard room that makes me think that it is something that they needed to draft around or avoid drafting from that position. Isaiah Collier cannot shoot. He likely won't shoot. That's why he fell to the back of the draft. On top of that, not a strong defensive player. He's probably a backup point guard in this league and probably will be a backup point guard for a long time. Keontae George is at ample opportunity, taking a lot of shots. Those shots are now going to go to Ace Bailey and others. I don't think Keontae George is long-term a starter in this league. If he improves enough of his shooter and the shots start falling, maybe he can be a kind of microwave scorer off of the bench. And overall, Walter Clayton Jr. is probably going to be the best three-point shooter on this team immediately upon coming onto it, other than Lauri Markkanen. I think that's going to give him immediate opportunity to be able to play. He's one of the older guards in this guard room immediately, despite coming in as a rookie. And I think he's going to be able to play a significant role off of the bench, but there isn't enough between Colin Sexton, who's going to be on an expiring contract this year, Jordan Clarkson, who's on an expiring contract this year. There's a real chance that by this time next season, we're talking about, well, Walter Clayton starts for the Utah Jazz. It might not last that long. They might draft over him next year in the NBA draft, but I think he's going to be a part of this Jazz rotation very quickly and have opportunity to be productive. I like him a little bit more in categories formats where I take him above draft slot. Points leagues, it's a little bit more muted of a stat set, and maybe you take him around draft slot. But Walter Clayton Jr. is a sound selection in both real life and fantasy this year.
Yeah, definitely a chance they drafted 2 starters for next season, depending on how, I guess, training camp or summer league and training camp go. And what other moves they make, because they do have Markkanen, they have Walker Kessler. They also have all these other guys they've drafted recently, and a lot of them I still think have upside, but they haven't proven much for one reason or another. I don't think Cody Williams is a guy that's necessarily impacting the starting lineup at this point after his rookie year, but a guy like Taylor Hendricks, who missed most of last season off an injury, I still really like him. John Collins is still in the mix. He picked up his player option. It'll be interesting to see how this rotation plays out in the short term. But like you said, long term, like this is what Ace Bailey wanted. It's just not where he wanted it. So I think could end up being a really good selection for Utah and a really good place for Ace Bailey to develop. Moving on to Washington, who was part of Utah's swap to get Walter Clayton. They got Trey Johnson at number 6 and then Will Riley from Illinois at number 21 after trading down from 18. Trey Johnson, I think, is maybe not the most polarizing. There's a couple other guys, partially Ace Bailey. We'll talk about Igor Demon, but one of the more polarizing players, I think, because everybody knows he can shoot. How good is he going to be offensively? How much can he defend? And then we also did have a question about how he would fit alongside Bub Carrington. How do you feel about what Washington brought in the draft last night?
Yeah, Trey Johnson is going to have opportunity in Washington right away because he is an NBA level shooter immediately. He's going to be one of the better shooters in the NBA straight out of the gate. You see him shooting off movement. You see him shooting off the catch. It looks exactly the same every single time. He is going to be able to shoot from the mid-range and 3 at a really strong level immediately as a rookie. It's a complicated depth chart for the fact that they have CJ McCollum, Marcus Smart, Chris Middleton, all kind of still hanging around on this roster, in addition to Bub Carrington and Keyshawn George. Now bringing in Trey Johnson, bringing in a Will Riley. I think it's going to be difficult for some of those guys to be able to get minutes, but I think Trey Johnson is going to be prioritized. He is the part of Washington's foundation going forward. They need him to be a big part of that foundation because it's going to make it work for them to be able to have this kind of shooting on the outside. This is kind of the first piece in their offense that I think really makes sense going forward. With Bub Carrington, there's overlap here, and yet in that they like to operate in the same zones. Bub doesn't get to the rim. Trey Johnson doesn't get to the rim. They both like to operate in the mid-range more than some other players do. And obviously will put up a good number of threes. Trey Johnson just does it all at a higher volume and better. So I think that in this, if you have Bub Carrington right now, it all is not lost in the sense that I think Bub and Trey Johnson could operate together. But I would not be feeling like after his rookie season and after seeing Trey Johnson coming in here that necessarily Washington is committed to Bub Carrington as a starting guard for them for the long term. That's possible, but I would consider him more in that kind of like fringe starter, high-end rotation level right now if you're to talk about his future trajectory versus Trey Johnson, who I think either toward the beginning of the season or about halfway through, once maybe they're moving on some of these expiring contracts, which they have many of on this roster, Trey Johnson's going to be a starter for this team in fairly short order. Extremely hard worker. I think this is a foundational piece for them, and I like him more than Carrington in dynasty leagues going forward. In fantasy, I don't love him as much as the draft slot. He's actually someone that in both points and categories formats I take a little bit lower because there's not a lot to the stat set other than scoring. It's really points, some three-pointers, and free throw percentage. Everything else, pretty much lacking. That's going to be inconsistent for you in a points league because you're depending on those big scoring games to be able to help you. And for categories leagues, there's just not a lot in the 9-category stat set beyond scoring to be able to work. So it can look a little bit like Norm Powell at its best, but it can also look like Norm Powell at its worst. And I think that's kind of what you're expecting from Trey Johnson going forward, where I might take him a couple slots. He's still in that kind of player picks 3 through 8 tier that I've been talking about, but the back end of that for me, because I think there's some high floor with him, but the ceiling isn't as high as it is for other players.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And it's him being, I guess, a better real life player than he is in fantasy basketball. I have him, I think when I've started making rookie rankings a little bit lower than that first tier of 3 through 8 with what you have. But I really do like the offensive upside. I think it'll be interesting to see how he fits in this rotation based on what Washington did last season. I would expect both these guys to at least have a fairly consistent role with Trey Johnson probably playing a larger role, but they've been very focused on let's see what we have in these young guys. Let's give them minutes. Let's give them reps and see how they develop. And then, of course, as the season progresses and they get closer to the end of the season and wanting to improve their lottery odds, I'm sure those minutes will skyrocket a lot. So we should get, at least for Will Riley, a really, really good look at him in March and April, if not earlier. And Trey Johnson, I think we'll get more of a look at across his entire rookie season. But excited to see what he can, because I see reasons to be hesitant about him and like his upside, but goodness, can he score the ball? So that's going to be a ton of fun to see how Washington can utilize him. I think New Orleans, moving on to them, it's pretty interesting to talk about their draft, because I think if you just looked at what they brought in, say, hey, they added Jeremiah Fears and Derek Queen, that's pretty intriguing. But what they gave up to get Derek Queen, I think ends up being a little bit more of an issue. And then also the fit with Derek Queen with, I guess, kind of the rest of this lineup. And how does Jeremiah Fears fit in after they just traded for Jordan Poole, and DeJounte Murray will be back at some point? What are your thoughts on this haul? How do you think Derek Queen fits in New Orleans, whether that is next to Zion Williamson as the center, maybe next to Yves Missi as a power forward long term? How do you kind of feel about what they brought in?
Yeah, as a lapsed Pistons fan, this immediately gave a shiver down my spine to the 2020 NBA draft. And that's where Troy Weaver gets control of the Detroit Pistons, and he's now the general manager of the New Orleans Pelicans, and comes in and takes Killian Hayes at number 7. And then trades in back into the first round to be able to take Isaiah Stewart at number 16. And it's almost exactly the same playbook. He had just also signed Jeremy Grant that offseason to be kind of a volume scorer for them, the way that they just brought in Jordan Poole. So it's this attempt to be able to create this immediate infusion that has no real plan underneath it. And that's what it felt like watching this. A team that has Zion Williamson still in the fold, but is somehow both drafting in ways that make no sense with Zion, but also giving up their future and the protection that they have in that future by now not giving up an unprotected pick in 2026, the better of their pick or the Bucks pick, which could, depending on if Giannis gets hurt, Giannis gets traded. If the Pelicans are as bad as I think they potentially could be with all the injuries that they inevitably seem to have every year, that pick could easily be in the lottery. That pick could easily move up in the lottery. And they gave that up for the opportunity to be able to take players that I don't think fit next to Zion particularly well, and that aren't going to make them that much better this upcoming season. But let's break this down one by one, and especially look at it from a fantasy perspective. With Jeremiah Fears, do not expect Jeremiah Fears to help you in fantasy basketball this season. If you are taking him, you are taking him with the idea that it's probably going to be a couple seasons where Jeremiah Fears is going to get the opportunity and minutes to be able to be a contributor in fantasy. Not only is he only 18 years old and reclassified just to be going into college, the NBA this year, he should probably just be starting his college career this upcoming season. But he reclassified to come in a year early the way that Cooper Flagg did. He is undersized. We know the history of undersized guards coming into the NBA as rookies. It is ugly, especially when they're as young as Fears is. And they just added Jordan Poole, who's going to be under contract both this year and next year, who's going to be starting most likely on this team. DeJounte Murray, let's say he doesn't even come back this year. He tore his Achilles back in January. It's going to be a long recovery for him. We're already hearing him complaining about the opportunity with the medical staff in New Orleans to be able to rehab his injury. I don't know if he's going to be a part of this team this season, but next season he's under contract. He's under contract beyond that. So that's going to be an impediment for Fears as well. It could be multiple seasons before we see Jeremiah Fears. That's why I'm taking him below draft slot in both points and categories leagues. There is the potential for him to be a long-term starting guard, maybe even an all-star guard. He can get to the paint at will. He is one of the best handles that we've seen from a guard in recent memory in the NBA draft. There's a lot of talent here, but it's going to take time to develop, and this is not a good developmental situation in New Orleans for many, many reasons. This isn't a good franchise in New Orleans for many, many reasons, and I wouldn't be betting on them. When it comes to Derek Queen, this is where we have to hold our nose and consider what the fantasy possibilities are. Because Derek Queen is going to be able to contribute immediately in the ways that Derek Queen does. He's going to be able to create offense immediately and be part of the offensive solution, at least to put up points while giving up probably way more points in New Orleans this year. The defense is going to be horrible in New Orleans with or without Derek Queen, but it is especially going to be bad with Derek Queen and Zion Williamson on the floor together. But they don't really have a whole lot of other options. Yves Missi is not good defensively yet either, and he's a poor fit next to Zion Williamson. They just traded off Kelly Olynyk. So maybe by the end of the season, when there's no one left to play, Karlo Makovic comes back in, but they're not going to commit to playing him big minutes either. Maybe they bring someone in free agency. But right now, the way that it looks is that Derek Queen is going to have to play a significant role on this team, both next to Zion Williamson for some minutes. I think he might come off of the bench, and that's going to be part of the solution, that he's going to play some of the non-Zion minutes, have some overlap with Zion, but he's going to have a significant role, and that's going to mean something for fantasy. For me, he sneaks into that top 3 through 8 tier because I think he's going to be functionally playing as many minutes as some of the top players who are going to be starting in this rookie class this year, or he may even start at points for the New Orleans Pelicans. Is it going to work out long-term? No, none of this is going to work out long-term for the New Orleans Pelicans. But for fantasy, I think it will work out for Derek Queen early and often. He is that kind of player who can contribute immediately, and I think he's going to need to on this team that is just going to need to try to outscore their opponents every night, because the only plus defender on this roster who's starting is Herb Jones. Jose Alvarado is a decent defender off of the bench. That's it. Otherwise, you have maybe a neutral defender and Trey Murphy and a bunch of negative defenders on this roster. So it's going to be a mess. I don't see the plan at all with this team going forward, and I'm not interested in investing in Fears. If you like Jeremiah Fears in your rookie draft, Just wait. A year from now, go trade for him because the price is going to be cheaper. Do not take that car off of the lot, buy it used a year down the road because you're going to be able to get it for a lot less. That's the play here. If you want to be able to get immediate production, I think Derek Queen's going to be able to give it to you. You can take him a little bit above draft slot. You might not even need to take him in that top 8. I think he's someone, because of where that he went, some of the negativity around him, you might be able to get him a little bit later, but he is going to help you immediately in fantasy.
Yeah, if you're expecting the coach to, or I guess at halftime of a game, and the team is struggling because the center power forward situation, whatever, you have to say Karlo Matkovic is not walking through that door right now, fellas. We have to step it up. Like that's not a good situation to be in. I agree with your sentiment on fears being, a couple years down the road, and I really like the used car analogy. Like instead of wait for it to roll off the lot, because it's going to look really bad in year one, no matter where he ended up. And now with this situation, it could look even worse potentially in year one. So yeah, you could probably get him at better value, trading him for him after the season. The fit is very strange with what they brought in. I think that Derek Queen could play next to Zion in the sense that it would allow the offense to work a little bit better. And I don't think the defense would be any good, but he is a better fit next to Zion on offense than Yves Missi is. So maybe they do try and make that work, and then Derek Queen can be a really good fantasy player. I think that's kind of what I'm hoping for, is that he gets the opportunity. And maybe after 1 year, they're like, okay, we're done. The Zion experiment, we've given it long enough. It's been 7 years or whatever, and we haven't seen him play in the playoffs. Okay, we trade him out. And then maybe Derek Queen is your power forward. Like that could work. And then they are able to adjust, and maybe that's what it ends up being. But if you're trading away your 2026 first with the idea that, well, we get this guy, and then maybe if we don't like Zion, we can trade him. And that, yeah, I'm not seeing it in New Orleans, which is nothing new. And I think that's kind of where everyone was at last night, basically. But it stinks because you were huge and very high on Derek Queen, and I love Jeremiah Fears, and now it seems like this is where our prospects are going to die, which that's just the way it is. The other team that really got, or one of the other teams I think that really got torn apart on social media last night was the Nets, who made 5 first-round selections because they traded for all these picks. I thought Yegor Demon was a bit early, but I was like, okay, like if you're invested in him, if you believe him, sure, get your guy. But then they take Nolan Traore at 19. Okay, like another point guard. Okay. I like Drake Powell, so taking him at 22 is good to me, but I understand that maybe not everyone is as high on him, and he's not necessarily a really good fantasy player or fantasy option, but he should get minutes, play defense. We'll see how much he can be offensively. He was a really good high school prospect. I like that one. And then they get another point guard and Ben Seraph, and maybe he's a little bit of a bigger guard, and maybe he can just be a playmaking off guard, but don't really think you're able to play the 3-point guards they've taken together. And then they get the 7-foot point guard and Danny Wolf. And now it's like, okay, like how do all these guys fit together? Are we just throwing darts and hoping 2 of them stick and just say, okay, we're going to be rebuilding for a while anyway. Hopefully at least 2 of these guys are good. Is that the vision here? And then how do we take all of that and say, yeah, I really like this player for Dynasty, because it's like they might cannibalize each other early on. It's kind of hard for me to say, oh, it's definitely going to be this ball handler over the other that's going to be better. I mean, I wasn't a huge Igor Demon fan. I like Traore, but not a ton. I like Ben Seraph, not a ton. I don't know. What do you make of all this?
So coming into this draft, I viewed the Brooklyn Nets situation as similar to what the Washington Wizards were last year, where there's going to be some rookies coming in and they're going to get to play immediately because there is almost nothing nailed down on this roster right now. If you take a look at this roster, the only pieces that are under contract are ones that we think could potentially be on the move in the form of Cam Johnson and Nick Claxton. You've got Terrence Mann coming in, who's going to play a role off of the bench in the recent Kristaps Porzingis trade. And then otherwise, it's players who are in restricted free agency like Cam Thomas, Zaire Williams, Day'Ron Sharpe, players who are on team options like Jalen Wilson, Tyrese Martin, Keon Johnson. There's not a whole lot here that is going to be part of the next good Brooklyn Nets team if that ever happens. And what ended up happening out of this is we now have a complete shift in what looks like the offensive philosophy of this team. Last year, tied for the slowest pace in the NBA. They barely had anybody who could bring the ball up, let alone somebody who could push the pace. And the goal here appears to be, from what I'm seeing, to be able to get a bunch of guys who can take and go, play fast in transition, because that offense was a disaster for how slow it was and how inefficient it was in the half court. they're not going to be able to have half-court efficiency. When things slow down, it's still not going to go well. But this team is going to try to pick up the pace. And I think that's what they're trying to do here, is actually get some guys who have positional size and can dribble the basketball. And the goal will be, we'll figure out shooting later. We'll figure out how to be able to be efficient in the half court later. We don't have that yet, but we want to play a style of basketball that at least gives us an opportunity, like the Chicago Bulls did last year, of let's just get out into transition as much as possible. So I think that's what we're going for here. When it comes to Jaeger Demon, this is one of the biggest risers for me on my draft board. And it's not because my opinion of him changed drastically as a prospect after last night. I did spend a little bit more time with Demon since I was last talking about him on this show, because I knew there were a lot of people who I respect who had a high opinion of him. So I went back and looked at it a little bit. And kind of what I found is this, a little bit of a middle ground between. I still think that the processing and passing are awesome. They're extremely high level. That's going to be there. He cannot create separation by himself. He's going to need a ball screen to be able to do it. So it's going to be really essential to be able to see who can they bring in to be able to set screens and to be able to put the offense around that, because this is also not an offense that set a lot of screens last year. They're going to need to do that for Jaeger Demon. When he does get to the rim, which he does not do often enough, he is actually pretty efficient when he gets there. And I think that is what they're hoping for in this, that his size is going to be allow him, if they're able to create an offense that is fit around him, that he's going to be able to take advantage of his size and to be able to finish at the rim efficiently. The three-point volume is really strong. The three-pointer doesn't go in enough. And the shooting has always been inconsistent with him. But here it is. This is number 8 draft capital. This is them putting the ball in Jaeger Demon's hands. You don't draft him this high. You don't use this premium pick unless you are saying, we are going to give you the ball. This is shades of Josh Giddey in Oklahoma City in his rookie year, where they just let him go and let Josh have the ball. And you saw the fantasy production immediately from that. It can be like that with Jaeger Demon. So I don't know if long-term it's going to work out. That's going to depend on the swing skill of whether he's able to shoot. That's going to depend on his ability to be able to grow in strength and develop his game in the half court to the point that it makes sense to have him be an offensive engine. I don't know if that's going to happen. What I do know is that they're going to give the ball to him and he's going to push it in transition. They're going to have him be the guy who the ball goes through more than anyone else on this team. And that's going to lead to strong fantasy production and assists. I think he's going to get a lot of steals. I think he will hit a number of three-pointers, even if the percentage is ugly. And you're going to have a fantasy game that is going to be relevant this season. That is worth investing in, even if it's a quick flip. Even if this is a guy who his best fantasy seasons come really early in his career, which we've seen from plenty of guards who come on to bad teams and get that, Michael Carter-Williams bump. That's what we're going to be looking at with Jaeger Demon. We saw with Josh Giddey in Oklahoma City as well, where it got worse as it went along. That could happen with Jaeger Demon. They could draft over him in the next draft when they have their draft pick again next year, because they're going to be able to keep it. They're not going to be swapping it with Houston. So they're going to keep that pick. They're going to get another premium player next season as well. This could be the best we see from Jaeger Demon, but when you're investing that rookie pick, you don't want to lose the value straight away. This could be a way to maintain the value of that rookie pick that you're investing in the top 8 of your rookie draft. And then you could move it for something more sustainable later if you don't see the long-term indicators getting better. If the box score stats are popping, you're still going to be able to trade him for considerable value going forward. And that's a strategy that I think is worth investment at this point. When it comes to the rest of the guys, Nolan Traore, a solid guard prospect. I think he improved a lot throughout his season in the French league. I don't see a huge opportunity, but he should be part of the rotation at points this year, if not the entire season, just for lack of other options in that guard room. And then when it comes to Danny Wolf, this is going to come down to, do they trade Nick Claxton? Do they give a long-term extension, a second contract to Day'Ron Sharpe in restricted free agency? We're going to see. I think that a lot of answers will be there. But Wolf, if he does get that opportunity, if they suddenly do not have 2 centers on the roster, if they're not interested in the Noah Clowney experiment going forward, he could also play next to those centers because of his ability to be able to handle and shoot. There's opportunity for Danny Wolf. Ben Surratt, Drake Powell, maybe. I think we're going to get a lot of answers to that in the next couple of weeks, where we see what they do with some of these players who are on team options, what this roster is going to look like. Those guys will probably have their moments in this rotation, because I think everyone will, just like we saw in Washington, like we saw in some of the worst teams last year. Everyone's going to get their chance to be able to play at some point, but I'm not placing long-term bets above their draft slot on either Ben Surratt or on Drake Powell, just because I don't think the fantasy stat set is there to warrant that kind of investment. Neither look like plus fantasy players based on my projections.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think Danny Wolf being a different type of center or different type of big than a lot of what they have, I really like the opportunity for him. Don't really see all three of the, like, I guess, more point guard players panning out, but I do think they would prioritize Igor Demon. I think, and you can tell me if you disagree with this, that free throw percentage is a pretty good indicator of how successful a player will be as a shooter in the NBA. Like, if they're a good free throw shooter in college, even if it's a bad 3-point percentage, then usually they'll be better in the NBA. Surratt, and this is also some international stats as well, obviously, but Ben Surratt shot 75.3% from the free throw line, and that was the best among this group. Traore was at 71.1%. Igor Demon was at 69.5%. Drake Powell was at 64.8%, and the Danny Wolf was an abysmal 59.4%. So hopefully they're better shooters in the NBA, but I think that is kind of the thing that is the question mark right now, is like, it's all these more dynamic players, but if none of them can shoot, then they got to figure that out somewhere, and it can't just be Cam Thomas step backs where they get their 3-point shooting from. Another player that you really liked, that I really liked, Colin Murray-Boyles. I don't love the landing spot in Toronto, just because I'm not sure exactly how he fits into the rotation. I was hoping he would land somewhere that he could start. I don't see that happening with the Raptors, with Brandon Ingram there, with Scotty Barnes there. Are you still super high on him? Or are you a little lower now? What does his landing spot mean to you?
Yeah, I still love the fantasy player. I don't see the immediate opportunity that I was hoping to be able to see for Colin Murray-Boyles. And you know immediately what they're going for here. Darko Rajakovic is immediately valued the ability to be able to have some small ball center play out there by playing Jonathan Mobo immediately, another guy who I loved last season and was imploring people to draft above his draft slot. And he did get immediate opportunity. And Colin Murray-Boyles is a better version of Jonathan Mobo. The problem is that this team still has Scotty Barnes at power forward, which is Colin Murray-Boyles' natural position. Neither one of them can shoot, and I can't see them fitting together on the court for more than just some, like kind of carryover minutes between each other, where they're going to have to play heavily in transition because the half-court offense is going to be a disaster. The problem with that is where do we go long term with this? He can play some small ball center minutes against bench lineups. He comes off of the bench behind Scotty Barnes. I still love Colin Murray-Boyles, and I'm still taking him around this draft slot, because if it does unlock and this roster gets shaken up, which I think it will inevitably need to, because this is not a team that is going to work. This Toronto Raptors team, as constructed, is not going to work long term. So while the situation isn't great right now, this isn't going to be the situation. It can't be the situation forever, because this team is not going to be a playoff team. This is not going to be a contending team, and it's not going to develop into one. So I would still bet on him long term, but I think the minutes are going to be in the low 20s in his rookie season. He'll be impactful as a per-minute fantasy player, so it'll still be helpful. That's why I'm still taking him around his draft slot, but I'm not expecting him to be an immediate starter on this team. I think that there maybe will be opportunity for him to grow into that as this roster gets shaken up in the future. I think he will eventually be an NBA starter, and he'd be another guy where I'd be looking to be able to add him if the minutes are a little bit more muted early on in his career, because I think long-term there's opportunity for growth and a lot of opportunity as a fantasy player. It's just not going to come right away.
Yeah, and he's coming in as a sophomore after 2 seasons at South Carolina, but he just turned 20 a couple weeks ago. So he's not one of these like super older prospects where they're like coming in at 22. Like, still has a couple extra years. So maybe things go really well for Toronto. Maybe the fact that there's other injuries in the East, they're able to get a playoff spot, maybe avoid the play-in entirely, or maybe get into the playoffs after a play-in, compete there a little bit, give them some optimism that, hey, we were right. This core is going to work. And maybe they want to give it a chance for a couple more seasons. And it's not the ideal scenario for Colin Murray-Boyles. Maybe he becomes a full-time starter at 23, 24. That still gives him plenty of time to be a really productive NBA player and really productive fantasy player for a long time. But we're probably just going to have to be a little bit more patient than I think we were imagining we were going to have to be with Colin Murray-Boyles. Moving on to Phoenix, they drafted, within 2 minutes of each other, they traded for Mark Williams and then drafted Kamin Malawach. Like, I remember I was texting my friend. I was like, oh my gosh, they just traded for Mark Williams. Maybe they won't take Malawach here. And then I look up and that's exactly who they took. So they addressed center. It's been an issue for them for a while, and now they have a solution. What do you think about them having these two Duke bigs mixed together and how this plays out in Phoenix and this just interesting lineup they'll have?
So this was a bizarre situation. It felt like, Shadow GM Isaiah Thomas must have been on the phone with one team. He's talking with Charlotte. We've got Brian Gregory and Matt Ishbia over here, and they're in the draft room, and they just didn't align. They were going to go get a center from Duke, and they did it. They both did it at exactly the same time, because this doesn't fully make sense for them, because they've invested quite a bit of resources now into the center position. They're going to have to invest quite a bit of resources into Mark Williams. And while they didn't pay as heavy of a price as the Lakers did in that rescinded trade to be able to get Mark Williams, they're still looking at him being extension eligible for his second contract this summer. They're going to have to make a decision on him about whether he's going to be a long-term piece for them. I think this trade suggests that they do think he's going to be. But these are two centers with very similar frames who couldn't be more different in their game. Mark Williams, if you watch him offensively, just really graceful, great hands, great touch around the basket. He's a really gifted offensive center. He's able to seal people off, be able to score efficiently at the rim, consistently creates offense for, being able to just move in space well as a big, and to be able to use his big frame to be able to create enough space to be able to get easy baskets. Kamin Malawach is not that. The hands are not that strong. If he does get his hands on it, he's going to be able to dunk it. And it's going to, he's going to be a guy who's going to have like over a 70% field goal percentage in the NBA. But the rest of the offensive game is fairly clunky. I don't really buy into the shooting upside. Maybe, that kind of situation where he's left wide open and he's able to get kind of that slow release going. It could be kind of like a Jonas Valanciunas level of big shooting, but I don't think he's going to be like Miles Turner out there where the volume is going to be at a level where it's going to make a big difference, or Kristaps Porzingis. I don't foresee that. I think that's something of NBA draft workout fantasy that we see from centers all the time during this process, where, they shoot threes now. And then we get in the NBA and it looks like Walker Kessler, like it's not actually going to be real. It's just kind of like a side parlor trick more than anything else. Malawach, however, is a much better defensive center than Mark Williams. If we could just fuse them, and maybe this is the goal that Matt Ishbia is thinking, just turn them into one center, combine them, merge them into one guy, then you have the best center in the NBA. They can't do that. So they're going to split the minutes between the two of them. And I think for fantasy, it's not really ideal for either. Williams is probably going to get the bigger share of that pie this season. Long term, maybe it's more of a full split. We might have kind of like an Okongwu-Capella situation where it seesaws back and forward, where neither side is really happy for fantasy. I was immediately gutted because it felt like this was going to be a great landing spot for Malawach. He was going to be able to play big minutes right away for Phoenix without really any other viable options in that center room, and then immediately got taken away from us. And also Mark Williams' opportunity kind of got whittled away a little bit, at least in the long term. It could look similar in the short term, but I think Malawach, for me, it takes him from being a guy that would have considered in that tier below Dylan Harper, along with VJ Edgecombe and Ace Bailey and Con Knipple. I would have considered him in that range. And now he's kind of more in that like fringe starter. Okay, ideally he gets starters minutes, but it might just be more rotation level. He's somewhere in between, like a lot of NBA centers are. And that could change over time, but this is going to be a situation where we might end up with Mark Williams with a contract extension. And the two of them, their first and second contracts just kind of run parallel with each other for a number of years. And we're frustrated the entire way that neither is getting the minutes that quite make them as valuable in fantasy as we would like.
Yeah, and I think that the other factor for me that we need to consider is Mark Williams' health, which has been an issue throughout Charlotte. We'll see if maybe getting him out of Charlotte, because it's not like they're known for having really good communication with their injury reporting and having a really healthy rotation. Maybe if getting him out of there, it's like getting in with a new training staff. Oh, we figured it out. Okay, now he's able to be healthier. He's playing more games, and it's the best thing for Mark Williams, even if he is in a minute split. Or maybe it's he does at this point have just a lot of injury issues, and it's consistently an issue moving forward. And then maybe we do get more Malawach minutes, and it's a nice insurance policy, I guess, for Phoenix to take him there. So there is a scenario in which both players, pans out well for them, and they are able to play a lot of games. And maybe it's not the best for fantasy, but it's good for their careers. Or maybe something else goes wrong for Mark Williams and the injuries continue to pile up and Malawach ends up just being the guy. So I don't hate it from that sense for Phoenix, but it is pretty wild that it happened within 2 minutes of each other, especially when there were a number of other talented players that maybe could have used to address other issues. Moving on, Portland traded back from number 11. And I'm so glad they did, because if they made the pick, they made it 16 at 11. It would have been even worse. And we'll get into that. But Cedric Coward, a guy that I really liked, that I think really rose up draft boards over the past 2 months. Memphis adds him a dynamic shooter, a good defender. I mean, he's not Desmond Bane, but he'll help make up for that loss a little bit. And now they're going from Desmond Bane with like a 6'4" wingspan to Cedric Coward with a 7'2" wingspan. A little bit of a difference there as far as getting into the passing lanes, playing some defense. How do you like this fit for Memphis? Do you think that Cedric Coward is a guy that could be able to potentially start for this team?
I think that could happen because there's a real lack here of players on this roster who can defend the other team's best perimeter player. And at the very least, Coward can defend wings at that level with his wingspan, with his defensive processing ability. I think that, and lateral movement, I think that he's someone who could pretty quickly become a top level, or at least very good NBA wing defender. And they need that pretty desperately. There was some hope that maybe when Vince Williams returned last year that he could at least guard smaller perimeter players. Maybe they can get that from him. Maybe they can get a little bit of that from KCP. But defensively, there's a big vacuum here that needs to be filled. And I think Cedric Coward fills it. That's why they brought him in. He's also going to be able to be that kind of prototypical 3-and-D wing. Offensively, he's going to be able to get up shots. I believe in the shooting. And for fantasy, it's a stat set that kind of doesn't hurt you anywhere across the board. It filled the stat sheet at Eastern Washington, briefly at Washington State. I think that he's going to be a really good fantasy player for a long time in both categories and points formats. I'm looking at him obviously outside of that kind of like third tier picks 3 through 8 that I was talking about before. But pretty soon after that, I'm considering him along with Colin Murray-Boyles, Common Malawach. I think they're all players who could eventually be starters at points and will help you in fantasy, B+ fantasy players. So those would be some of the first picks that I'd be taking in that range once we're getting outside of the top picks.
Yeah. Interested to see exactly how they use him. Obviously, if they traded up to 11, I don't think they gave up a ton to move up, but moving up means that they really believe in him and were trying to get him before someone else did. So it'll be interesting to see how he fits in the rotation year one. Chicago took Noah Essengay with the number 12 pick. A really young player. The shooting isn't necessarily there, but I think could be a good defender, a good off-ball player, good finisher, would probably get some easy buckets from Josh Giddey. I don't know. How do you feel about Noah Essengay, especially now that we know that he's in Chicago, where things are kind of, I don't know, just stuck in mediocrity right now?
Yeah, this was pretty fascinating because Noah Essengay, if you look at the frame, the body type, he's almost exactly the same as Modest Buzelis. They're both around 6'10", both around 200 pounds, really high-waisted, thin frames, but athletic finishers, some nascent ball handling ability for their height. And you can see them fitting in, and Essengay fitting in kind of similarly to the way that Buzelis did last year in transition. Essengay and Buzelis, running up to be able to catch passes from Giddey, being able to finish at the rim, cutting and getting passes from Giddey. That's what they're envisioning with this. The problem, at least for fantasy, is that you still have Patrick Williams clogging this roster. He's probably going to play some amount of minutes. Buzelis is going to need some minutes. And then on top of that, there's just not an opportunity for him to emerge as a starter. I think like lower level rotation player, at least in the beginning. And he's going to need to develop as a shooter the way that Buzelis did. And I felt better about Buzelis' shooting in the pre-draft process because he at least done it better at amateur levels prior to a season in the G League shooting than we've seen from Essengay. Essengay has a better ability to be able to get to the rim and draw fouls than Buzelis does. So I like that aspect of his game a little bit more. But they're kind of cut from a similar cloth, and I think not necessarily that they're going to block each other, but it's more difficult to be able to see Essengay ascending into a really big role on this team in the short term, and long term, it's going to depend on whether he shoots or not.
Yeah, because then you also, I mean, this isn't going to deter them from drafting anyone, but you have Patrick Williams in the mix as well, and they have to kind of figure out what they have to do with him. But again, that's not necessarily what you're considering when you have a lottery pick. Is how does this impact Patrick Williams? Moving on to the next pick, we'll talk about because we've already talked about the next couple of picks in the draft. It's OKC at 15. As we kind of expected, the rich were going to get richer. They got Thomas Sorber, one of my favorite centers in the draft, and has a really strong fantasy skill set. Probably not going to play a lot the next, I'd say 2 years at least, but eventually is going to be, I think, a really strong center for OKC and a really impactful fantasy player. Are you kind of agreeing on that?
Yeah, I think that with Sorber, this is the Isaiah Hartenstein replacement.
Mm-hmm.
And that could come as soon as the 26-27 season. It's not obviously going to happen this season, but there's a team option that they're going to have on Hartenstein in that season. And the team's going to get a lot more expensive at that point as the extensions for Jalen Williams and Chet Holmgren are going to be kicking in. So that's where having the luxury of being able to pay a center the way that they did Hartenstein at the top level of the center market, they're probably not going to have that luxury anymore to be able to hold this roster together. So I think this is planning, and this is the way that this is going to work for Oklahoma City. They're going to be able to get the luxury of using these draft picks, bringing them along slowly, and having them fill in roles as some of the players kind of get too expensive that are filling roles for them around their core three going forward. And I think Sorber can be that guy. He has some of the passing ability that you see with Hartenstein. He's going to set hard screens the way that Hartenstein does. He's going to bring some of that bulk and rebounding ability that they got from Hartenstein as well. And we've seen that fit next to Chet Holmgren. So while a lot of people might look at this and say, well, I'm not that interested because they already have Chet. Sorber's only going to be playing backup minutes. We saw a lot, especially in the regular season, of Chet and Isaiah Hartenstein fitting on the court together. It worked well. We're seeing double big lineups work well because of the way that it allows you to dominate the offensive boards and use that size to be able to get extra possessions. I think Sorber is going to have a really good role in his prime in Oklahoma City. I think he's a really good fantasy player who doesn't hurt you in many areas that normally you see from big men. If he continues to develop his shooting, he did take some threes at Georgetown that didn't go in that well, but he's shooting them. The free throw shooting isn't going to hurt you that much. He does bring something in the assist category, so it's not the automatic negative that it usually is for a big man there. I like a lot about Sorber. I think people aren't going to be excited about this landing spot. But if I have a pick in the early teens, I am gladly taking him for the long term because I think eventually he could fit into minutes in the mid to upper 20s, the way that Hartenstein has in Oklahoma City. And you could have a really valuable fantasy player in those minutes. Have some patience. Thomas Sorber is going to be worth it.
Yeah, definitely a great spot for him long term, but I think that is going to cause him to slip a little bit in rookie draft. So if you like Thomas Sorber like I did, maybe it'll be a little easier to get him. Maybe you can get him a couple picks later than you were expecting. Because if he landed somewhere like a Phoenix where he was going to be able to play a lot early on, he probably would have gone much earlier in your rookie drafts. But now long-term, still really like him. Okay, next pick, we need to figure out what happened. We need to figure out what's going on. So Portland trades down from 11. Apparently, they decided we can't trade down anymore. We can't risk anyone taking Hanson Yang, who pretty much every mock had him going in the second round. I liked him as a second round flyer with more upside to be better. He's a tall guy that can pass the ball. That's exciting. And then all of a sudden he gets taken at 16. And it's okay, if they were at 11, would they have taken him? Who were they trying to avoid stealing Yang from them? So they felt we have to take him at 16. We can't trade down anymore. We can't take someone else and trade back up. Really just an interesting situation to occur. I would love to get what your initial reaction was. And I think originally I was okay, I was lower on him as a prospect, but it's kind of like what you were talking about with Yegor Demon, where it's this team is investing a lot to bring in this player. They just took him with the 16th pick. And pretty much I would assume that if this just really doesn't pan out, that whole front office could get fired. That's a fireable offense. If you're taking this guy that's projected to go mid-second round, take a mid-first round, that's not a good pick if it doesn't pan out. So did you like Hanson Yang before? What was your reaction? What's your thoughts on him now that we know that he's a mid-first round pick, not a mid-second round pick?
Yeah, I from what I can gather, I think what we heard pre-draft and kind of what I've heard since is that maybe there was some concern that Brooklyn was going to go get Yang. And that didn't end up happening because obviously the Portland was trying to trade back a little bit further. They couldn't find a deal to move back further from 16, and they just said, we're going to get our guy. it makes no sense from the perspective that they already have what should be a future at the center position in Donovan Clingan. They already have a present at the center position in the form of DeAndre Ayton. They even have the specter of Robert Williams playing games at the center position. That could happen for a handful of games this season before he inevitably gets hurt again. So I don't understand that. What I do understand is that I liked Hanson Yang before this draft as a center who, for his size, and he is big, has really good touch, moves fairly nimbly. He's not a stiff. His passing ability is a positive. There's a lot to like about him as a project big that has been playing in a league that is not competitive at all. And yes, he was, I believe, Defensive Player of the Year in that league. It is one of the worst professional leagues that you're going to find internationally. And I don't think we learned a lot about him until we saw him at the Combine, where admittedly he performed really well. There is not value in taking him at 16. I think the reaction to the pick shows that. I don't know long term if this is going to turn into anything other than kind of a punchline, a laugh that we have about a pick going here. It's another Papagiannis situation, the way that Sacramento took him out of nowhere years ago. But the vision, I guess, the most favorable version of it is that this is a guy who has different strengths than Donovan Clingan, that as a duo, they could have 48 really strong minutes from the center position, and the curveball of a guy who could be kind of the outlines of a Nikola Jokic. No one's going to be anywhere near that level, and those comparisons are useless. But I think that's what they're envisioning, a really big playmaking center who's going to give them an offensive element that's going to be difficult for teams to be able to deal with when they're dealing with a dominant defensive infrastructure around him. I think it's going to take years for that to be able to happen. I don't see any opportunity for him to play early on in his rookie season if he is coming over immediately, which it sounds like he is. This is not going to be someone that you're going to want to take in a rookie draft earlier than his draft slot. I think he's going to fall because of the pre-draft evaluations, having him as a late first round or second round pick. It's going to be unlikely that people are going to be taking him around draft slot. You can wait and take the luxury of the upside a little bit later on, because I do like the fantasy game. I think there is solid fantasy game here. He's not going to hurt you in many categories. He's going to give you the big man stuff without taking a lot off the table in other areas. There's a lot of positives here. It's just going to take years down the road. And then at the end of that road, there might be nothing there for you.
Yeah, I think that immediately seeing a lot of people say, oh, we got Chinese Jokic, or they got Chinese Jokic. Like, that's like, come on. Like, we were talking about Colin Murray-Boyles, and I think a lot of people brought up like Draymond Green comparisons of the sense that he's an undersized forward that is a high-level defender. And a lot of people said, if you're comparing him to an absolute anomaly, then it's probably not a fair comparison for him. And just if you're expecting that, then you're probably going to get disappointed. And I think the same thing applies here. If you're expecting this guy that just because he was supposed to go second round and now they took him in the first round, that maybe they just drafted Jokic, I think you're going to end up being pretty disappointed. I would expect Portland to trade DeAndre Ayton and maybe Robert Williams and maybe even Dwight Breath, some sort of mixture of trading some of these guys, because it doesn't make sense to have like 5 centers on the roster. So I would assume at least one of them is moved. And it is more of a long-term project. I bumped him up. I mean, originally I just slotted him in. I was like second round dynasty player even after he got drafted. And I think I've started to move him up a little bit, somewhere in the 20s as far as where I take him in a rookie draft. But we'll see where I end up fully landing on him after we get done with the whole draft. But one of the wilder things we've seen happen in the draft recently. But definitely helps him from a dynasty perspective. Moving on to Minnesota. They drafted Rudy Gobert Jr. and Jan Berenjay, and I think that that's kind of the vision here, is for him to develop for a few seasons, and then as Rudy Gobert ages, they have a new dynamic French center that can run the floor well, block shots, and rebound. Is that kind of what you're gathering as well?
Yeah, I think that this is a long-term project. We've got Rudy Gobert stretching out to the 27-28 season on a $38 million player option that he's almost certainly going to pick up. So unless they're able to find a taker for Rudy Gobert, you're looking at the next 3 seasons, backup minutes at best for Berenjay. And I think the concern here is he's super athletic. He's going to block a bunch of shots. The per minute fantasy production could be helpful in that way, get some streamable blocks. But at the other end of Gobert being done, Are they going to have a better option at center? Are they going to look at him and say, well, you're still kind of a backup or a rotation big more than someone that we're going to build our entire defense around? We don't know, because this is a fairly raw prospect who has a lot of athletic potential. But the realistic outcome for him, especially because no team jumped into the lottery to be able to take him, realistically, I think the evaluation on him is that this is a rotation center who is going to provide you energy and some, rim protection ability. And anything you get beyond that is kind of a plus that is unexpected. So I'm not taking him above draft slot in rookie drafts. I think this is, again, a guy who you can probably, if you're interested in him, if you think he's showing flashes, wait, because you're probably going to be able to get him fairly inexpensively as he waits behind Rudy Gobert for at least a couple of seasons. I'm not looking to jump after the Beringer project, because I think it's going to take some time for it to bear any fruit in the NBA.
Yeah, I imagine it's at least a few seasons. And then again, back to the same thing we just talked about for a couple different players. If your vision is that this player is going to be a multi-time defensive player of the year, one of the best defenders of the modern era, then maybe you're setting your sights a little high and you'll probably end up being a little disappointed. Moving on to Miami, somehow miraculously having Kasparas Jakubonis land at pick 20, a guy that I think some people had top 10, but was pretty much considered a consensus lottery pick that could potentially slide just outside, to just fall in Miami's lap. What's the fit like here in Miami? I think I'm a little bit more optimistic about him now that I know that he's in Miami, and I assume he's going to be battling it out with Davion Mitchell for the starting point guard slot potentially. I mean, Tyler Hero will start, Bam Adebayo, and I think they have a little bit more solidified in the front court, but in the back court, I mean, his competition for minutes is probably Mitchell, Pelle Larson, Duncan Robinson. So I feel good that he's going to get a lot of minutes early on and could potentially start. How optimistic are you about him from a fantasy perspective?
I think if we could lock in what Miami's roster is going to look like, even, assuming that Davion Mitchell is brought back in restricted free agency, then you could say, yeah, he's probably going to be in the rotation. I would not get ahead of myself to think this is going to be a starting point guard this season, because if the Miami Heat thought that, or the league thought that, he wasn't going to fall to number 20, and he fell to number 20 for reasons that we understood. And it's a thin line for a guard who's going to be an lead guard, an on-ball guard, to be good enough to be a starting guard. You have to reach a certain threshold, or teams are just not interested. And he didn't meet it. And the reason he didn't meet it is, if you watch him, he's not really going to blow by anybody. The shooting is good. The volume is not that high. The efficiency is not that high. He can shoot off the dribble a little bit. I think he can be an off-ball shooter as well. He feels a little bit more like your third guard. And I think that you're getting comparisons to maybe like a Bogdanovich, where, like, yes, you could start him for a little bit, but the scoring isn't going to be at the level that where it's worth how bad the defense is going to be in a starting position. Starting him next to Tyler Hero, I don't think he's a terrible defender, but Hero's already such a negative that you're not getting the benefit of that. That's why Davion Mitchell's probably a stronger fit. And then add in the fact that Miami is likely going to change up this roster further. I don't think they're just going to roll back out a team that looked like they had no business being in the playoffs again and say, well, Kasparas Jakubonis is going to make the difference between us getting swept by the Cavs into being a viable roster this season. I don't foresee that happening. So, yes, I think he could likely be in the rotation because he can beat out a Pelle Larson, because Davion Mitchell can only play so much. But I think there's more moves to come here. And I would not be betting on, if I take this guy, I'm going to get a starting point guard this season and beyond. I just don't think that's who Kasparas Jakubonis is. I think the league just passed judgment that that's likely not who he is. And the hot shooting that he had at the start of the season, the way that receded, the way that the turnover rate continued throughout the season, the way that he just struggled against stronger competition at times at Illinois, I think that ultimately kind of steered the evaluation of the NBA away from him being a starting guard in the league. Maybe he'll prove people wrong. Miami's done it before with picks in the teens and into the 20s. But here I would lean toward the realistic outcome more being that he's a rotation guard, someone that I'd still probably take above draft slot. I think I'd take him above 20. I think, considering him in kind of the mid-teens makes sense in rookie drafts. But I would not assume that you're going to get the highest level outcomes that maybe we thought months ago for Kasper Jonas.
Yeah, that's a very fair way to put it. I think the fit next to Tyler Hero is also, yes, it's not going to be good defensively, and that's not what Miami's going to want to do next season. So that's entirely fair. I think if there is a situation where he is playing a lot, we saw him provide a lot of points, rebounds, and assists in college, and not a ton of defensive stats, but a good free throw shooter as well. So maybe this could be a pretty productive fantasy player if he gets that opportunity. But like you said, like, it might not happen immediately. It's not a great fit for a team that's looking to probably win a championship. I doubt Pat Riley's going to want to be going through any sort of rebuild this next season. We have a few more picks to talk about. The next one being Asa Newell headed to Atlanta after the Hawks traded back. I think getting that 2026 first, unprotected first from New Orleans or Milwaukee is just an incredible haul on its own. But as far as Newell, I think he fits in. He slots in as a backup forward, could play the 4, maybe some minutes at the 5, but they have a Kongwu and Kristaps Porzingis there. A high energy, high motor player that we need to see some development from, whether it be as a shooter or on the defensive end, for us to really feel good about him from a fantasy perspective. But I think he contributes a good bit to the Hawks early on and throughout his career.
Yeah, I think the non-Trey minutes in Atlanta are always a question mark, and what they're going to need is probably it's going to be a lot of heavy transition, a lot of Jalen Johnson running the court, running some point forward, and someone like Asa Newell who's going to be sprinting right there with them, being able to finish athletically. That's probably what Asa Newell's role is immediately in the NBA, of being really a high energy rotation player, because there's not enough size to be able to be a center here. And there's not enough shooting ability to be able to play the 4 for meaningful minutes. So it's really going to come from being kind of that spark plug, high energy bench player early on. And maybe some of that other stuff will develop. He's going to have to become a better shooter if he's ever going to be a starting power forward in the league. I don't think he's going to be a starting center because I just don't think he has the size for that. But this overall for Atlanta was a great draft day because they made an incredible trade. And I still think they got a talented player, not that dissimilar from the talent that they probably would have gotten had they stayed at 13. And I think that, while I don't have high hopes for Newell as a dynasty prospect, I think he's someone that I'm probably considering right around his draft slot, maybe even a little bit lower if there's some players that I like a little bit more. He's someone that at the very least you can see nestling into that rotation, assuming that he can beat out like Mo Gay for kind of those backup forward minutes. He could be someone who plays in the Atlanta rotation this season.
Yeah, not the best dynasty spot, but I'm excited about him as a Hawks fan. But OKC had pick 24, traded it to Sacramento, ended up being Nick Clifford. Think he's a rotation, kind of like a backup, unless they make some more trades, which it's definitely possible that they do. But if he's getting minutes, I think he's going to be a pretty productive fantasy player, both in year one and over the next handful of seasons at least. Is that how you feel as well?
Yeah, Nick Clifford is one of those guys who really takes nothing off the table in fantasy. It's going to be a pretty smooth stat set where he contributes in all areas. Really strong rebounder for a wing. Developed into a really good playmaker in his final seasons at Colorado State. The shooting was great this past season. We'll see if that can hold going forward. But I mean, if it does, this is a guy who, at the very least, is going to be a very valuable rotation wing who could have times in his career where he does start. There's obviously a lot of potential turnover in Sacramento that could be coming in future seasons between the inevitability that DeMar DeRozan is going to be out the door at some point. I don't know if Zach LaVine is going to be happy in Sacramento for that much longer. Domantas Sabonis, eventually they're going to not build the entire team around him. So there's another version of the Sacramento Kings team that Nick Clifford is going to be a part of, where there could be ample opportunity for him and Keegan Murray to be able to be the kind of the forward wings on this team. And I really like him as a fantasy player just because he has a smooth stat set that doesn't take anything off the table, plus rebounder for his size that helps you in points leagues. This is a good player to be able to take, I think, a little bit above draft slot, even though I don't think he's going to have a chance to start early on. There's growth potential here because he's a good fantasy player.
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised that he fell to 24. I was expecting him to go either probably late lottery or just outside the lottery. So good value for Sacramento to trade up and nab him. Orlando got Jace Richardson. I think he was pretty much mocked to Orlando, whether it was at that 16th pick or whether it was at this 25th pick for a while now. It's a really good fit for him to play next to two 6'10" playmaking forwards. With Desmond Bane there now, he's not going to start immediately or play a ton, but I think a really solid reserve and a really good player. Do you like this fit in Orlando for him?
Yeah, this was a need for them. I mean, right now, I think we're probably going to be seeing, like we did in the playoffs, Corey Joseph playing if they bring him back in free agency, which I expect they will. Corey Joseph is probably going to be kind of the backup point guard on this team behind their starting lineup of Suggs, Bane, Wagner, and Boncaro and Wendell Carter Jr. That, with time, could be Jace Richardson's spot, playing next to Anthony Black off of the bench as kind of the rotation guards there. We've seen it be difficult for young players to be able to get significant, consistent minutes on this team. It could be a little bit of a redshirt year for Jace Richardson, but such an efficient player. I think that his size obviously is the reason that he fell. I mean, you can see it on the screen here, only a little over 6 feet tall without shoes. It's difficult to be able to make it in the league at that size unless you're a really dynamic offensive player. And Jace is not that. He's kind of more, the perfect glue guy who fits in and keeps your offense running at a really efficient level, can do some stuff on ball, but doesn't need to, can shoot off the ball. And he's going to have to become a better defensive player. He's in a good environment to be able to do that. And I like him long-term as a rotation guard sticking in the NBA. I'm not really looking to take him much above draft slot here, but there is some growth potential for him to be able to, at the very least, be a guy who plays minutes in the low 20s across his prime in a rotation. And I think that it could be a good home for him there in Orlando to do that.
All right, 2 more picks to talk about in this first round, with Boston adding Hugo Gonzalez, who didn't play a ton for Real Madrid this past season, but obviously that's an incredibly talented roster. So the fact that he got minutes at all at his age is pretty impressive. A really talented player they were able to add. Unclear at this point. I haven't seen anything either way saying if he's going to be stashed for a season or if he's going to come over immediately. But if he does, and I think what could be kind of a transition season, a retooling season for Boston, he could play a large role, and we could get a nice taste of what he can be as a player, see how much the shot can maybe develop. But I think he's a pretty dynamic transition player on both sides of the ball. Is this a pick that you like for Boston, and how do you value a guy like this in Dynasty?
Yeah, it's difficult with Hugo Gonzalez because he didn't play a lot for Real Madrid this year, but you can kind of see the toolkit of an NBA wing. He's got the frame for it, 6'6", over 220 pounds, athletic. I think people might not always assume, as European prospects coming over, he's probably a stiff. No, Hugo Gonzalez has some vertical explosion to his game. He moves pretty well laterally as well. I think that they're going to, this is a project, and they have the luxury of being able to bring it along as a project. He's probably going to be, competing with Jordan Walsh to be the back end of this rotation. I don't expect him to play this upcoming season unless the year really goes off the rails for Boston, but we'll watch to see what we get from him from Summer League. It does sound, there are really some reports that he is going to come over. We'll see if that's true. But if not, it's someone to be able to track going forward. But there's at least the outlines of an NBA wing here, and that's sometimes more than you can say at the back end of the first round.
Yep. And last pick of the first round, to talk about Yannick Konen-Niederhauser to the Clippers. A nice backup big for Ivica Zubac, a nice pick and roll rim runner, mate for James Harden. I guess has the potential to be a solid field goal percentage, rebounds, blocks, prototypical center in fantasy, but probably not a great opportunity for him. But is there still a little bit of upside here?
Yeah, I think Konen Niederhauser is going to fill in a role pretty immediately. It seems like this is kind of a need position. We know it is because they were trying to play Ben Simmons minutes at backup center this past season. Maybe they bring Simmons back, but I think what they would ideally like to have is a pick and roll partner for James Harden who isn't Ivica Zubac. There's not a lot of potential for Konen Niederhauser, I think, to become like a big minute starting center in his career. It's certainly not going to happen in LA, but a good athlete who should be able to rim run immediately in the NBA. I think that this is a good environment for him to be able to come into with a lot of competent pick and roll operators. And I like him as someone that you could take if you had a need in a deeper league for a big man to be able to get, some good per minute block numbers, some solid rebounding. Konen Niederhauser is going to be able to fill that role for you. For shallower leagues, I don't think there's the upside here because I just don't think he's likely to become a starter. But for deeper leagues especially 30-team leagues where it's hard to find centers who are viable, this is someone who I think could have a nice career as a bench big.
All right, so that was the entire first round. If we just do a couple quick hit best available for the second round, some players that we should be keeping an eye on their landing spot. A couple guys I like, Rasheer Fleming and Maxime Reynaud. I was a little bit surprised that they didn't go round one. Anyone you'd want to add to that list as far as guys that you were expecting to go in round one that even if they go here early round 2 or kind of towards the middle, could be really impactful dynasty players.
Yeah, I'd echo that on Fleming and Reynaud. I think they would, for me, depending on what happens with them tonight, they're players that I could draft above 8, 9, 10 players who went in the first round because of their fantasy stat sets. So that's going to be something to monitor. Reynaud especially, I think, could have like a Kyle Filipowski-like fantasy impact depending on his landing spot this season. So that's going to be really interesting to watch and see. I like Ryan Kalkbrenner, similarly, to be able to come in and play immediate minutes in the NBA as a center, a more traditional center than Reynaud, but he obviously has more than an ample resume from college basketball to be able to be I think, a rotation level center right out of the gate for whoever takes him. Adu Thero is a really interesting wing prospect who's super athletic, disruptive defensively, cannot really shoot, cannot really dribble, cannot really pass, but he looks like an NBA wing, and someone's going to take that ball of clay and see what they can mold into. And then beyond that, there's a few guys that I like. Javon Small out of West Virginia as a guard prospect. I think that he could have some opportunity to be able to come in and be a backup guard for someone early on in his career. Vlad Golden is an interesting center prospect. Cam Jones is someone who has a combo guard I think could have some value. Plenty of guys that we'll be able to talk about, I think, hopefully next week as we get dig deeper into this. And I would be remiss if I did not give the people what they want. If you will indulge me, and I know we've been going long, but just my initial idea of rankings for categories and points leagues, because I know that's something that a lot of people are going to be looking for. Let me say as a disclaimer, you should not be already drafting. I don't think you should even be drafting like immediately after the draft ends, because so much is going to change with teams as we go into free agency. Draft at least after free agency dies down. Draft closer to summer league. Get more information, because we are dealing with an information gap compared to NBA teams. We don't know what their plans are, and teams are just going to make managers are going to make bad decisions because they just don't understand where these teams are headed. They don't have all the information yet. But if you do have to draft right now, here's what I'm thinking. At least for categories leagues, it's Cooper Flagg number 1 with a bullet. Then it's definitely Dylan Harper. Don't mess around with that. Number 1 and number 2. Right now, I have a tier 3 through 8 that I've been talking about throughout this podcast in categories leagues that's also similar in points leagues. This 3 through 8 for categories leagues would be Ace Bailey, VJ Edgecombe, Con Knippel, Jaeger Demon, Derek Queen, and Trey Johnson. You could mix those guys around, and I don't think there's big value difference between them. There's different pros and cons with a lot of them. The common denominator is I think they all get early opportunity, and I think they have long-term viability, either because they have really strong fantasy games or their floor as an NBA player is so high that they're going to have a really long career as an NBA starter. But all those guys kind of fall in that tier where I think they're going to get starters minutes, and either they have enough fantasy ability or enough real-life value to NBA teams that they're going to be long-term viable starters. It's going to be very similar in points leagues, where I would have it Ace Bailey, VJ Edgecombe, Jaeger Demon, Derek Queen, Con Knippel, and Trey Johnson. A little bit lower on Knippel in a points format, as we've talked about previously. Then we get down into the next tier, which I kind of view as more like fringe starter, heavy rotation player, good minutes, maybe minutes in the 20s at their peak, but I'm not guaranteeing that I feel like they're going to be a starter long-term. They might be. And that begins with Jeremiah Fears, who maybe in a few years we are talking about him being a starter. And in the highest end outcomes, he could blow away that projection. But the lower level is also really low. The short-term outlook is not that great. I'd have it number 9 in both categories and points formats. Then at number 10 in both formats, I'd have Colin Murray-Boyle. So I think has some of the most fantasy potential in this entire class. I do not like the short-term outlook. I don't think he's going to be a starter right away, but I do think the fantasy potential is there, that even in a rotation role, he's going to be really valuable in fantasy. So he still sneaks in to my top 10. Then in number 11 in both formats, I would have Kamen Malawach, who I think is going to immediately play this year for the Phoenix Suns. His minutes are going to depend on the availability of Mark Williams, but he could emerge as a big minute starting center as soon as this year if Williams isn't as available as the Suns would like him to be. And it still remains to be seen if there's going to be that long-term commitment. I would have Malawach up in that tier in 3 through 8. If I knew that he was going to have that immediate shot and that long-term shot to be a big minute starter. I just don't know for sure that's going to be there because of the complication of Mark Williams being brought onto the Phoenix Suns as well. Then at number 12 in both formats, I'd have Thomas Sorber, who I think long-term, like we talked about earlier, can fill in that Isaiah Hartenstein role, play a lot of overlap minutes with Chet Holmgren, and be a long-term part of the Oklahoma City Thunder as a player who plays in the mid to high 20 minutes, a really good per-minute fantasy player who can be a really strong top 75 fantasy producer in mid to high 20-minute levels. Then finally at 13, 14, I would take Cedric Howard and Carter Bryant, both of which kind of that 3-and-D wing, but better fantasy game than you usually get from a 3-and-D wing because of strong defensive playmaking and an ability to be able to hit threes at a level that is usually better than your average 3-and-D wing. I don't think they hurt you in a lot of areas. I like both of them to be able to eventually develop into starters. So I'd be able to willing to take them kind of the back end of that lottery in fantasy, picks 13 and 14. Beyond that, you're getting into a lot of players where it's rotation level. I'm not really sure if they're going to be able to become starters. You might value immediate production a little bit more than long-term potential. We'll talk about that going forward, but that would be my top 14, my lottery from this class.
That is your sneak peek at Matt's rookie rankings at this point. I'm sure the entire thing will be posted on your Patreon at some point shortly after the draft ends. So be sure to check out Matt's Patreon. You can follow him on Twitter at NBA Dynasty ADP. This was an hour and a half of elite Dynasty draft content. So if you're serious about winning your Dynasty League and doing well in this draft, this was a phenomenal episode to check out. Matt, anything we can be on the lookout from you? And also, as always, thank you for joining me for this.
It's my pleasure, Noah. As usual, if you want to check out my content, I'm going to have the largest dynasty rankings for rookies that you can imagine. I already have 227 players projected. Every single player who did a workout, every single player who went to a combine, every single player who was measured. I went through them all, and I did find some really interesting gems. Guys who aren't going to get drafted tonight, they might not even be two-way players, but they're going to be at summer league. So if you want to know every single player, if you want to find the guys that come out of nowhere to others, that's what I'm bringing to the table. If you are a sicko like me in a 30-team league, or if you just want to be ahead of every single person in your 10-team league, these are the rookie rankings for you. They're going to be posted by tomorrow on patreon.com/NBA Dynasty ADP. It is my pledge to go deeper than anybody else does when it comes to rookie rankings. I hope that you got something out of this today with the two of us. We will continue to bring this kind of content to you all here on this YouTube channel. And if you want to go deeper, check out what I have to offer, patreon.com/NBA Dynasty ADP.
100% check that out. If you enjoyed this content at all, like he said, it's just going to be even deeper over on his Patreon. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Young Man Squad Fantasy Basketball Podcast. And we will see you next time.